You put on the rose-colored glasses and forget that in the 50s some people couldn't vote. And you're like, but the cars were so cool back then.
Really what it comes down to is appealing to the brand of the past,
Yeah.
and not so much...
That's exactly it, the brand of the past.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Zachary Koch.
And I'm your host, Matteo Guthrie, and this is...
the Your Next Film podcast.
a podcast dedicated to films, indie filmmaking. Gear, sometimes.
And sometimes we get existential.
Like, what happens when your film's really bad and it's just absolute garbage?
What does it say about me as an artist?
This is a podcast devoted to talking about making films as kind of the amateur indie filmmaker caught right in the middle as a young professional, and giving advice, commentary.
To add to that, I would say that our role to our audience, we're mentors in some sense, but we're also giving them permission to create, because it's really weird to be this artist that it's hard to self-motivate to make things. And sometimes it just takes a stranger or a friend or family member to just say, hey, you should make that thing. So our topics for today, or topic rather, nostalgia for old formats.
Let's break it down just to nostalgia, specifically why I don't like it. Nostalgia, as you will know, is you put on the rose-colored glasses and forget that in the 50s some people couldn't vote. And you're like, but the cars were so cool back then. And, economically we were better, except for the times that we weren't. But, so on, so forth. And within that, obviously it's like the past will always look better to you because the past is certain. You know what will happen because you are on the other side of it. Mm-hmm. And within nostalgia, things were better when I was growing up, right? Mm. That translates over to, every 30 years or so, a specific decade gets a lot of media attention. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the 2010s were basically an homage to the 80s. Mm-hmm. We love the 80s. We're not going to mention that it was a cultural graveyard. We're not going to mention the fact that the young hip creators of the 70s kind of got squashed by studio interference in the 80s, historically. But we liked Top Gun, so
yeah.
So on and so forth. I'm not immune from my nostalgia for the past. I have a muscle car from the 1970s.
Yeah, you do.
I take care of, and sometimes it runs.
Put insert B-roll of it not running here.
B-roll of it sitting in my garage.
It's funny. I'm glad that you led with defining nostalgia as kind of not just being fond of the past, but seeing the past through rose-tinted glasses, because that really is what it is. And it's so strange that as humans who have a negativity bias, we remember the past so fondly. It's like the bad parts you just completely forget about somehow.
It's like running a marathon. You forget all the middle part where you're like, oh, I'm never going to do one of these again. I'm miserable. It's like when I finish the marathon, 2 weeks later, I'm like, yeah, I'd do another.
It's like giving birth again.
People talk about the summer of 1969, especially in the post 9/11. It was that kind of that golden year, except there were a bunch of assassinations, a bunch of crises. It was not a good time to live. The Vietnam War was going on.
Yeah.
But people still hold it in high esteem. People who weren't born then hold it in high esteem because, again, echoes of the past. Mm-hmm. But all of this to say that I fall solely, very, very solidly within the person who has had nostalgia from the past.
For sure.
We need to stop doing that.
So there's kind of two aspects of this conversation. Part of it is the formats that were used in the past, and then
we'll get to that.
But what do you mean by using nostalgia in your art? Not talking about the formats, but when you say we need to stop doing that, what do you mean by that?
Every 10 years or so, they'll reboot another franchise. They'll reboot, for example, Ghostbusters got a reboot, and then another reboot when the first reboot didn't do well. And it's why did we need more Ghostbusters? We really didn't. The first movie was kind of the perfect encapsulated Ghostbusters film. And then everything after that has been pretty mediocre. But they know they can sell it because people want that 80s nostalgia. Now I'm seeing even 2014 nostalgia. I'm seeing people move towards specific eras within art, and just everybody makes art about this specific era. Everybody's making art about the 80s right now, right? I feel a lot of people are oh, I really like artistically the way this era looks. The rose-colored glasses come on and all you can see is the fun shirts of the 90s.
The cars were more colorful back then.
Yeah, the cars were more colorful back then. In the 80s, the cars had cool digital gauges, even though most cars from the 80s kind of suck. There's pros and cons to any decade, right? But when everybody kind of fixates on I keep bringing up the 80s because that's what the past 10 years have been, and now people are bouncing into the 90s and even Y2K.
It's the 30-year cycle.
Yeah,
you
the
talked about
30-year
before.
cycle has happened. That's accelerating slightly with like social media and micro trends. But
Skinamarink was one of the biggest like indie horror films of recent memory. You know, it kind of went viral.
Yeah.
And that was steeped in nostalgia and not just the old formats,
is that
but
set in the 80s?
it seemed that way just with like the way the house was built and
Yeah,
everything.
fair.
But oh yeah, absolutely. Like the old cartoons and whatnot.
Oh yeah, you're right.
In the tube TV. I couldn't tell you what decade it was exactly, but it definitely a former decade, not modern day by any means. I mean, even the indie film scene isn't immune from the...
No, they're not.
Because you brought up the reboots of films. That makes a lot of sense just because you're giving people more of what they like. So, you know, I liked Ghostbusters back in the day. Like, let's make another one. I get the appeal, or I get the incentive to do that. But even the indie films aren't immune to appealing to that nostalgia.
No, they're not. And again, I see a lot of like... This went more on in like the comics section of art, but in comics, a lot of stuff suddenly started going like indie comics set in the 80s, kind of like a Stranger Things type horror thing going on. And I'm like, oh, okay, another one of these. And like, I'll give them, yeah, sure, the aesthetic is cool. I like that you're like doing this. You know, I like that like cyberpunk has become cool again. Because like Blade Runner, all of that. I'm like, oh, this is great.
I like synthwave music.
Yeah, synthwave music. Like, I can't hate on it. But even so, I feel that a lot of people are basically shoehorning themselves into a marketable segment.
So they're not doing it in ways that actually contributes to the story.
They're just kind of just blinded by, the 80s, you know? Back in, let's say, 2014, what was the 20s were actually a weird craze, and with like Gatsby and all of that.
Oh yeah.
There was like 1 year where we did like everything was like Great Gatsby themed. But you also saw a lot of, I wish I was in the 50s. I wish I was in the 60s. I wish I was like that like 2014 bohemian craze where everybody kind of dressed like a hippie.
Really what it comes down to is appealing to the brand of the past.
Yeah.
And not so much...
That's exactly it. The brand of the past.
Yeah. And instead of telling stories that could only take place in the 80s. And that it's in the 80s because the story wouldn't work in any other decade.
I have stories set in the 80s. I have stories set in the 90s. I have stories set in the early 2000s during the global war on terror. It just depends on what the story calls for.
We talk a lot about doing things for a reason and having an intention behind them. And so it sounds like when it comes to appealing to like former decades, don't force your art into those categories and into those brands. Maybe tell stories in decades that, actually could stand to take place in that decade.
Especially as an indie filmmaker, why would you just buy into that brand rather than furthering your art? Because right now you don't have a studio telling you that, hey, we really want this to be set at a certain time because this is a trend, et cetera, et cetera.
But also the current day is going to become someone else's nostalgia later. So might as well make things that take place today. And then in 20 years, it might be cool.
Or make them take place in the 30s or in the 40s.
Yeah.
Choose a time period that it belongs to rather than making it belong to a time period.
Well, speaking of brands in the past, there's a lot of brands that made cameras in the past in various formats.
Yeah, various formats.
And part of the nostalgia discussion is also this kind of resurgence in using old tech. I mean, it's always been the case.
We recently had an episode discussing like, is film relevant anymore?
We're also seeing like the digicams as kind of on the
digicam is
backside
coming
of that.
back as like we are transitioning into like 90s. If you've noticed, like drum and bass music is like getting really big in like soundtracking things. That was a child of the 90s. We're getting right into 90s nostalgia. Seinfeld is funny again.
For filmmaking specifically, the video camera formats as well, not just film photography and digicams, but like I heard someone talk about they referred to an old camcorder as a digicam. I was like, that's weird. I don't know if I would call it a digicam.
No, like a digicam has always been like
it's
like
a point and shoot,
90s,
like 2000s really.
Yeah,
I think mine's from 2005.
My dad did some 90s stuff with like early digital cameras because my dad is a gear freak. So I always was like, oh yeah, the 90s, like the really big digicams, and then now like there's the little digicams.
Yeah, they're so tiny.
I love them.
They're like the smallest cameras you can buy. Like I have the
fantastic form
smallest digital camera on the market right now is probably the Ricoh GR3. and it's kind of massive compared to my Digicam. Like, I'll show you. It's really fun.
Is it just the sensor?
Partially, yeah,
Okay.
but it's still a tiny camera compared to, you know, like a DSLR. We have a Nikon D3 over there, which is a
Big boy.
chunky boy. Nikon's first full frame digital camera. Very, very fun camera, and gets amazing results even in 2024. But as far as formats for filmmaking go, you know, we had VHS.
Yeah.
There was definitely some nostalgia for VHS, and a lot of films, horror films, a lot of them were, you know, shot on VHS.
Anything that says SCP generally has like a VHS filter on it.
That makes sense, though. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But now we've got, like, we're moving to high 8 and all the 8mm digital formats. So we had the video 8 formats, and then now mini DV, which was even smaller and higher quality. But these formats are coming back, and people are starting to use them for projects. But I think they're doing it for the wrong reasons. It seems like a lot of people's home movies were shot on these formats, and so they're viewing these formats through the optics of their childhood. They're vlogging, for example, on old camcorders, and that makes a lot of sense because they're these consumer formats were used to document the past. Now they're documenting the present in a style that resembles the past. So in a way, the final result is something that it looks like something you could be nostalgic over, even though you shot it like yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of people are doing it. And you know, the Gen Z, like we're Gen Z as well, but the Gen Z that are kind of on the cusp of like pop
the
culture and stuff.
tastemakers.
Exactly. That's what they're doing with it. You bought a high 8 camera not too long ago.
$5 at a fill a bag.
Dude, I don't think you
thrift
realize
store.
how crazy of a deal that was.
I was like, does this work? And I was like, it's $5. If it doesn't,
try it out.
well.
Absolutely. Because those are getting expensive because of the craze.
Yeah.
But I never considered using old formats aside from using like a professional mini DV camera to kind of shoot things in the style of a 2000s commercial. So funny because even our own art is steeped in nostalgia, which anyone that's familiar with our work will know that. But I didn't even consider using older formats than that until I think you recommended we shoot on your high 8. And I'm super glad we did, but I'm not nostalgic for high 8. I mean, my home videos were on VHS-C. My parents had a short little stint of making home movies, but that lasted for a couple years max. And then after that, I don't have anything. And so it was VHS-C, a little nostalgic for that, I guess. But after that, just basically straight to digital.
My dad was kind of always a gear freak on the cusp of like camera technology.
So are you nostalgic for high 8?
You know, I am simply because I recall using an old high 8 to like do little home films. Like,
Oh, nice. Do you still have those?
I do not know where those are. I remember watching home videos on that. There's video of me, you know, rolling around in like a baby walker thing.
So a little bit.
Yeah, I have some of that nostalgia, but really like my nostalgia lies in that digital. Like I think that really the closest nostalgia to high 8 I have is there was a little like, I'm not even sure what to call it. It was a digital camera, but it recorded onto floppy diskettes.
Oh yeah, that's a thing.
And I would make stop motion films with it.
Lego animations?
Yes,
That's
Lego
what I did too, dude.
animations.
That's how I started.
And I didn't have whatever software to actually animate them. So it was just, you had to press like the forward
Dude,
key
I did that
really
too.
quick.
Yeah. So funny.
And I have nostalgia for that. I like will admit that fully. But really for me, if I'm not progressing artistically and pushing myself and I'm just like, oh, let me imitate something from the past, then that format is holding me back. High 8 is really just let me do an interesting thing people aren't doing because they weren't doing it at that time, other than Tom Levine, who, you know, he was shooting like JDM drift meets on Super 8 and it looked the coolest I'd ever seen.
Yeah, that's super cool.
He's on another level. But like I really hadn't seen people doing short films with high 8 at the time.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, this is something
specifically
new for me.
The things that I do see people doing on high 8 and VHS and mini DV, they're not making regular films. Like when we made Does God Love Robots, we shot that very traditionally.
Yeah, like
with a tripod, with film lights. The workflow was similar to a regular film project. Now the camera lent itself to the quick and dirty stuff, which was great. What the format added to that project was the lower quality image created more abstraction. And it really hid elements of the frame that either weren't worth looking at, and in its place built suspense by not revealing the full scale of the scene in any particular shot. And so that abstraction really added to the tension and really made the film just steeped in atmosphere.
And like shooting on film can also do that. Film just has that energy to it.
It's got that grain, that texture.
It's got that grain, it's got the texture. And like even frankly shooting digital and putting that film grain over it, if you can get that aesthetic that you're trying to pull for whatever you're trying to say with this film. But if you're just doing it to do it, to have like, oh, this is trendy, maybe that's limiting you.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like if I'm shooting on film and therefore that alters my my workflow because like I don't get to watch playback or anything for this, like that's great. But if I'm just shooting on film because like it's cool and I know it's going to get me views, like is that really what I should be doing artistically?
Yeah, it's not a higher.
It's a distraction.
I could see that for sure.
Stop being nostalgic. Move forward. Like we had 20 years of just pure nostalgia.
And that goes back to using it for the sake of using it and not using it to tell better stories.
Nobody's looking forward to the future anymore. And this is a mass generalization. Obviously, there are people looking forward to the future. If it's not helping you move forward, it's an active hindrance. And that's what a lot of nostalgia can be. In writing, it's like, oh, weren't the 70s better? And it's like, were they really better? You know? They weren't. Most people in the 70s were kind of pissed off that they were in the 70s.
We talked a bit about like how the past wasn't as good as we think it is. But to bring it back to the format kind of discussion, it's not just that people are doing it because it's trendy. They're doing it because it's trendy, but they're also limiting themselves because they're shooting things in a way that they remember the past on those formats instead of using them in normal ways.
That's a very good point.
And so, like I said earlier, people's home movies were shot on these things. They're shooting vlogs on these cameras for the nostalgia and for the fact that it's trendy. And they're leveraging the unique elements less to make things in the way they would normally make things. So like I was saying with the Does God Love Robots thing, using a tripod, actually lighting your scenes, approaching it like a film, but just changing the format. And that's what I don't see people doing.
Again, like it's fine if you do shoot it like a home movie. I'm not the cops. We're not going to show up at your door,
or maybe we will.
Stacked up, tacked up, like freeze, drop the high 8 camera.
Obviously, if the story lends itself to that sort of thing, but I see people only doing that is the problem.
We shot a film, Choose a Wagon, and that was written in a nostalgic manner. It's supposed to be like a dealership
promo.
Yeah, dealer promo film. For a wagon, not any specific brand because legality. But we shot it and put the film grain over it, and it looked like it was drenched in sepia tones, and it was gorgeous. I still love that film.
Not sepia tones, but
not sepia.
Drenched. No, definitely not. Sepia tones like brown.
Yeah, there's a little brown in there. There's no brown.
It's a very saturated, bright film.
I have nostalgia for this film, I guess. I'm seeing it through brown tinted glasses. It's a very like old style film, and it's shot that way.
But that was the whole identity of the film.
That was the whole identity of the film. In other things that we've put film grain on, because I know there's other projects we've done that
almost
for.
All of the recent ones, actually.
I think The House That Eats has pretty significant kind of pulpy black and white.
Yeah.
And it serves the film without being shot like a 60s film necessarily.
For sure. Yeah, The House That Eats is a weird case because the filmmaking style is modern, but like the style is, we used intertitles. That's an old silent film thing.
That's something that I just continually do. It's an obsession of mine.
Yeah.
We can talk. We'll do a titles episode later.
Let's do that.
Where Zach can just be mad at me to my face, and then I will continue to.
Titles are great.
I will continue to defend the title with white knuckles.
You can't use titles as a storytelling crutch. Forcing your audience to read in a movie too much is a little obnoxious.
Gaspar Noé begs to differ.
Well, we're not that cool.
I mean, I could be as cool as Gaspar Noé one day.
One day. I'm just as of now.
A girl can dream, can't she? But to our point, nostalgia, it's great. I love nostalgia. Stop doing it. Just for a little bit. Yeah. Challenge yourself to do something that isn't nostalgic. If you're I've never been nostalgic. I just keep, forging towards the future of film. Like, great. Good for you.
Yeah.
You didn't need to watch this.
You're probably shooting on a Ronin 4D and you hate tripods.
Regardless, nostalgia is not like you're not evil for being nostalgic for being nostalgic for 2014. Like that's not.
You might be evil for other reasons.
Yeah, you could be the evil genius trying to bring back Imagine Dragons.
I like Imagine Dragons.
You like Imagine Dragons?
Yes, I like them. They're not my favorite artists, but they're pretty high in my book. I mean, A-tier artists. I'd put them in A-tier artists.
They were always fine for me.
They had a few songs that were pretty I was like, this is different.
What's your favorite Imagine Dragons song?
Oh, I don't have a favorite.
Radioactive?
No, Radioactive is speaking of 2014 nostalgia.
Is anybody nostalgic for Radioactive?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
No way.
I mean, I'd say your average person would hear that song and be like, oh yeah, I remember it was like 10
I
years
was
ago.
always an AWOL Nation fan.
That's cool.
See, they kept moving. They kept moving after they put out Sail, and everybody lost it over Sail, and then
Yeah, Sail's
they
good.
kept making music.
I did a parody of that song and filmed it in college. It was very fun. I don't think I ever showed it to you. It's called Fail.
You've mentioned it. You've mentioned it to me.
Have I
before.
really?
Yeah,
it's
and
silly.
I've been like, oh, interesting. Then you will never show it to me. So.
Yeah, I have a couple of music videos that I recorded that I star in. Yeah, that was like a team bonding thing we used to do.
Nice.
Yeah, but anyways, nostalgia for Imagine Dragons and old camera formats.
AWOL Nation. Don't forget AWOL Nation.
Who could forget? Not me.
I have nostalgia for when Marvel films felt fresh.
I can see that.
Like
Like
I don't
Iron
know,
Man,
Captain America, the Winter Soldier holds up.
well, even
still.
like the first Avengers film.
Iron Man, everything through the first Avengers film, I could at least like be like, yeah, it wasn't the best film, but it felt new. It was like,
They're kind of painful to watch now.
yeah. I watched Sam Raimi's Doctor Strange sequel.
Oh, I didn't know
And
Sam Raimi directed that.
Bruce Campbell's in it.
Really? I need to go watch this just for
Bruce
that.
Campbell's in like all the Spider-Man films. It's just like random characters.
I had no clue.
I think it's Uncle Ben's car is also the car that Sam
Really?
Raimi's car. It's the one from Evil Dead. He puts it in all his films.
Nice. It's like
So
the yellow station wagon.
No, it's not a station. It's a sedan. It's a Oldsmobile Delta 88.
You would know.
What can I say?
Nerd. Well, anyways, that was our PSA about
Our
nostalgia.
PSA on nostalgia. Stop doing it.
Also, we
Do
do
it if you
too.
want. I don't care.
Continue using old camera formats if you want. Be nostalgic for the past.
Be
Put your
nostalgic
movie,
if you want.
movie in the
Nobody's
80s,
sending you to jail.
but just ideally have it serve the story and serve your audience. That's all we're trying
More
to say.
importantly, have it serve your artistic journey.
Yeah. Also, if you want to hear us talk more about film formats, we did an entire episode about film specifically. So go check out that episode, link in the description. And with that out of the way, this has been
Your Next Film.
Thank you so much for watching.
And go make a movie.
Just go freaking make a movie.
Make a movie. Make
you
something.
dweeb.
Calling them dweebs? Go like and subscribe. Also, you're a dweeb. So.